She was a woman who had walked through storms and crossed mountains that many never dared to climb. Her name was known in many offices, boardrooms, and business circles, not because she was born into wealth or had a family name that opened doors, but because she had carved her way through a world that was not always kind. From the earliest days, she had faced doubt. People looked at her and thought she was too young, too inexperienced, or too different to succeed. But each time someone closed a door on her, she learned to build her own. Each challenge made her sharper, stronger, and more determined to rise. As a child, she grew up in a small neighborhood where dreams often felt too heavy for the narrow streets. Her parents taught her the value of hard work, but even they never imagined how far their daughter would go. She spent evenings studying under the dim light of a lamp, while her friends played outside. She listened closely to every story of those who came before her, the leaders, the builders, the dreamers, and she promised herself that one day she would not just dream but live the kind of life people wrote about. When she entered the business world, it was like walking into a storm. Many looked at her and assumed she would not last. At meetings, she was sometimes ignored. When she spoke, her voice was brushed aside. She saw men with less experience rise quickly, while she had to work twice as hard just to be noticed. But instead of breaking her spirit, every slight became fuel for her fire. She learned to stay calm when others doubted her. She learned to listen more than she spoke, and when the moment came, she would deliver her ideas so clearly that no one could deny her brilliance. Years passed, and slowly, she built her company. It began as a small idea on a piece of paper, a dream to create something that would last. She worked long nights, often alone, sometimes with only a notebook and coffee to keep her company. There were moments she nearly gave up, moments when the money was low, the risks were high, and failure felt like a shadow following her. But she held on. She remembered her promise to herself, the little girl who once sat by a lamp with big dreams, and she kept moving. One breakthrough led to another. A small contract turned into a big deal. A hesitant investor became a loyal partner. Soon, her company grew from a small office with 2 employees to a respected firm with hundreds of people working under her leadership. Her name became a mark of strength. People who once doubted her now admired her. Magazines wrote about her journey. Conferences invited her to speak. She had become more than just a businesswoman, she was a symbol of resilience. But she never allowed success to make her arrogant. She remembered where she came from. She remembered the times she had been underestimated. She carried those lessons with her, using them to treat people with fairness and dignity. To her, leadership was not about power but about responsibility. She knew that the way she treated others would always matter more than the number of deals she closed. One of her proudest achievements was buying her own private jet. It was not just a luxury but a necessity, as her business now took her across cities and countries at short notice. For her, the jet was more than a machine, it was a symbol. It reminded her of the nights she spent dreaming under that old lamp. It reminded her of every person who said she would never make it. Each time she stepped onto that plane, she felt a quiet victory inside her heart. Owning the jet also meant she traveled with her chosen crew. She wanted her journeys to be smooth, her time in the sky to be peaceful. After all, the hours on the plane were often the only time she could rest between meetings and responsibilities. She expected professionalism, respect, and care. She valued people who worked with dedication, just as she had done her entire life. Yet, even as success surrounded her, challenges never truly disappeared. There were always whispers, always glances from those who could not accept her rise. Some smiled to her face but held quiet resentment. Some admired her but envied her deeply. She knew this truth well. She had lived with it all her life. And though she carried herself with grace, she also carried an unshakable strength. If anyone tried to disrespect her dignity, she would never allow it to go unchallenged. On this particular day, she was preparing for another important journey. She had meetings scheduled with top leaders, decisions to make that would shape the future of her company. She boarded her jet dressed simply yet elegantly, with her usual calm confidence. The crew greeted her, and everything seemed normal. But in the quiet air of the cabin, something felt slightly off, though she did not show it. Her eyes noticed everything, her mind recording even the smallest details. As the engines roared to life and the jet lifted into the sky, she leaned back into her seat. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to breathe. Success had given her many things, but peace was still rare. Looking out of the window at the clouds, she reflected on her journey, the girl she once was, the woman she had become, and the future that still awaited her. She did not know that within this very flight, a moment would come that would test her strength in a new way. It would not be about business or money, but about respect, dignity, and leadership. A test that would remind everyone around her that no matter how high she soared, she had never lost the courage to stand firm when challenged. The journey in the air had only just begun. The CEO sat quietly in her seat, her eyes focused on the clouds that stretched endlessly outside the window. For her, the jet was usually a safe space, a place where she could think, rest, or prepare for the next big meeting. But as the minutes passed, she started to notice small details that were not quite right. The smiles of the crew seemed forced, the tone of their voices lacked warmth, and the energy in the cabin felt slightly tense. The crew had been with her on several flights before, and most of the time things went smoothly. But today, something was different. One flight attendant, in particular, carried herself with an air of impatience. She greeted the CEO, but her eyes revealed annoyance, as if she resented being in service to someone she did not truly respect. The CEO noticed this instantly, though she chose not to react. Years of leadership had taught her that the strongest people do not respond to every little irritation. Instead, they wait, they watch, and they decide when it is necessary to act. The CEO settled into her seat and opened her folder, glancing through important notes for the meetings ahead. Her company was entering a new chapter, one filled with expansion and opportunity. Every decision she made in the coming days would affect not just her life, but also the lives of hundreds of employees who looked up to her. She was the kind of leader who carried that weight with seriousness. She believed success was not about one person but about lifting an entire team toward a better future. The crew began their service routine. Drinks were offered, meals prepared, and everything was meant to feel luxurious. But the same flight attendant continued to show signs of carelessness. She placed items too quickly, almost without looking at the CEO, and her tone had a sharpness that did not belong in such a professional space. The other attendants noticed it too, but no one said anything. They kept their heads down, afraid to involve themselves. The CEO, however, was not blind to the behavior. She had dealt with this kind of attitude many times before in the business world, people who allowed envy or pride to cloud their professionalism. She reminded herself to stay calm. This was not the first time she had been underestimated or treated without respect, and it likely would not be the last. But what the flight attendant did not know was that the woman sitting in that chair was not only a passenger, she was the owner of the very jet they were working on. For the CEO, moments like this were not just about personal feelings. She understood the bigger picture. If disrespect was ignored, it grew. If poor behavior was left unchecked, it spread. And as someone who had built a company based on values of fairness, dignity, and professionalism, she could not afford to look away. As the flight continued, the tension became harder to ignore. The attendant's words were clipped, her gestures careless, and her patience thin. Once, when the CEO asked for something simple, the attendant sighed loudly before fulfilling the request, as if it were an unnecessary burden. It was subtle, but it carried a message. The CEO remained composed, though inside she was already weighing her response. She believed in giving people chances, but she also believed in accountability. Looking around the cabin, She noticed the quiet eyes of the other crew members. They were aware of what was happening, but none of them stepped forward to correct their colleague. This silence spoke volumes. It revealed not just one person's lack of respect but also a team's failure to uphold standards. In her mind, leadership meant more than doing your own job, it meant ensuring the entire group stayed aligned to values. The CEO leaned back in her chair, calm but thoughtful. She remembered how, in her early career, she had once been treated with the same kind of dismissiveness. People would ignore her ideas, brush off her words, or act as though she did not belong in the room. At that time, she did not have the power to respond. But now, the story was different. She was no longer the outsider fighting to be heard. She was the leader, the decision-maker, and the one with authority over her environment. What made her different from others, however, was not just her power but the way she chose to use it. She had never been someone who acted out of anger or pride. Instead, she believed in acting with purpose. She knew the coming moments would require her to stand firm, not just for herself but for the lesson it would teach everyone watching. The sound of the engines hummed steadily in the background, but inside the cabin, the air felt heavy. The CEO closed her folder and set it aside, her eyes lifting to study the attendant who seemed to carry resentment in every step. She wondered silently what had led this person to such behavior. Was it jealousy? Was it frustration? Or was it a lack of discipline that had gone unchecked for too long? Whatever the reason, she knew that allowing it to continue would set a dangerous example. As the plane soared above the clouds, the CEO's thoughts shifted to the bigger truth she had learned over the years. Respect was not something that could be demanded, it was something that was expected through the way people carried themselves. And when someone broke that trust, it was the responsibility of a leader to restore it. She had never allowed anyone to diminish her dignity, and she was not about to start now. The crew carried on with their tasks, though the unease among them grew. The CEO remained composed, but those who knew her well could see the quiet strength in her eyes. She was waiting, giving space, but also preparing. The moment of decision was coming, and when it arrived, it would not be loud or dramatic. It would be firm, clear, and unforgettable. For now, she stayed silent, her thoughts steady, her posture calm. But in her heart, she knew this flight was no longer just about reaching a destination. It had become something else entirely, a test of respect, of leadership, and of the principles she had built her entire life upon. And soon, everyone on board would realize that when dignity was challenged, this CEO would never sit quietly and allow it to be taken away. The jet flew smoothly above the clouds, but the air inside the cabin felt heavier with each passing minute. The CEO sat in her seat, calm on the outside, but completely aware of the growing tension. She had given the crew time to correct themselves, to act with the respect and professionalism expected of them. Yet the one flight attendant who had shown irritation earlier continued to allow her attitude to show. It started with little things. She placed a tray down too firmly, as if annoyed. She spoke quickly, her words lacking the polite tone passengers should always hear. And then, as if she could no longer hold back the storm inside her, the moment arrived. The CEO had asked for something simple, something any passenger had the right to request. Instead of responding with patience, the flight attendant's eyes flashed with frustration. Her steps grew sharp as she moved closer, and then, in a shocking instant, she did something unthinkable. Her hand lifted, and she struck the CEO across the face. The sound seemed to echo louder than the engines of the jet. For a split second, the cabin froze in silence. The other attendants stood frozen, their eyes wide in disbelief. No one could have imagined such a thing happening, not here, not to this woman, not in the middle of the sky. The CEO did not move. She sat perfectly still, her face calm, her eyes steady. She did not rise in anger or shout in return. She had been in situations all her life where people tried to strip her dignity away. And each time, She had chosen strength over weakness, clarity over chaos. This moment was no different. Her silence was not weakness, it was control. The flight attendant, realizing what she had done, stepped back slightly. Her face showed regret for a second, but pride and stubbornness quickly covered it. She muttered something under her breath and turned as if nothing had happened. But the damage was already done. Every person in that cabin knew they had just witnessed a line being crossed, one that could never be undone. The CEO slowly lifted her hand and brushed the side of her face where she had been struck. Her movements were calm, almost too calm, as if she were holding all of her emotions inside, letting none of them escape. Her eyes lifted and swept across the cabin, meeting the gaze of each crew member. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if time itself had stopped, waiting for her decision. She leaned back in her chair, her breathing steady. Inside her mind, memories began to surface, moments when she had been underestimated, when people had tried to silence her, when her worth had been questioned. Those times had taught her that dignity was not something others could give or take away, it was something you chose to hold onto, no matter what. For 10 long minutes, she remained silent. She did not speak a word, but her very presence filled the cabin with tension. The crew avoided her eyes, yet every one of them was aware that something powerful was coming. They shifted nervously, whispering among themselves, unsure of what to do. The one who had struck her tried to act busy, but her movements were clumsy, betraying her unease. The CEO finally lifted her head, her calm composure unshaken. She pressed a button, calling the crew together. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft but carried weight, the kind of tone that made people listen even if they did not want to. The attendants gathered, standing before her like students waiting for a lesson they knew would not be gentle. Her eyes moved from one to another, not with anger but with authority. She told them, in clear words, that respect was not optional. She reminded them that professionalism was the heart of their work, and when that was broken, everything else lost its value. She did not raise her voice, but every word struck deeper than a shout ever could. The one who had crossed the line shifted uncomfortably, but the CEO did not address her alone. She spoke to the entire crew. She explained that silence in the face of wrongdoing was no less harmful than the act itself. Each of them had seen what had happened. Each of them had chosen to stay quiet. And in her eyes, that silence was unacceptable. The attendants glanced at one another, guilt heavy in their faces. None of them had defended her, none of them had spoken up, and now they understood the weight of their failure. They had thought their jobs were secure because they served on a private jet owned by a woman who rarely raised her voice. But they were learning that her silence did not mean weakness, it meant she was giving them time, and when that time ran out, her decision would be final. She paused, letting her words hang in the air. The cabin felt smaller, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Then she spoke again, her tone steady, unshakable. She told them that their service was no longer required. Not just the one who had disrespected her, but all of them. The entire crew. 10 minutes after being struck, she made her decision. She dismissed them all. The attendants gasped quietly, their faces pale with shock. Some opened their mouths to protest, but the CEO raised her hand gently, and the words died before they could be spoken. There was no room for debate. Her decision was final. She told them that respect, once broken, could not be repaired with excuses. It required action, accountability, and courage, things they had failed to show. Her words cut through the cabin like lightning. She spoke not with anger but with clarity. She explained that leadership was about setting examples, and she could not allow a single act of disrespect to poison the culture she had built her life upon. By firing the entire crew, she was sending a message not only to them, but to anyone who thought dignity could be ignored. The silence that followed was heavy. The crew stood still, their eyes lowered, their future uncertain. The CEO turned her gaze back to the window, her expression calm once again. She had made her decision, and she did not need to say anything more. Her actions had spoken louder than any speech ever could. As the plane continued through the sky, the crew quietly gathered their things, each one lost in thought. They knew they would never forget this moment. They had witnessed not just authority, but true leadership. And though they had lost their positions, they carried with them a lesson that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The CEO remained seated, her face serene. She did not celebrate, nor did she show satisfaction. For her, it was not about pride or punishment, it was about principle. She had protected her dignity, defended respect, and reminded everyone that silence in the face of wrong was never an option. In that quiet cabin, flying high above the world, she had once again proven who she was, a woman of strength, of clarity, and of unshakable resolve. The silence inside the cabin was unlike anything the crew had ever felt before. The decision had been made, and there was no undoing it. The CEO had spoken with calm authority, and her words had carried more weight than any shout could. She had fired the entire crew, and though the engines of the jet continued their steady hum, the atmosphere inside was tense, heavy, and filled with unspoken thoughts. The attendants, still in shock, looked at one another, unsure of what to do. None of them had expected such a decision. They had assumed she would punish only the one who had crossed the line, perhaps demand an apology, or at most remove her from service. But to dismiss them all, to hold every person accountable for silence and inaction, this was something far greater. It was not just discipline, it was a statement. The CEO leaned back in her seat, her eyes steady, her face calm. She knew what she had done would be remembered. She also knew that her choice would not be popular with everyone. Some would see it as too harsh, others as too bold. But she did not act to please the opinions of others. She acted to defend a principle that she had lived by all her life: respect is not negotiable. The dismissed crew members stood quietly, gathering their belongings, their movements stiff and hesitant. Their minds raced with regret. They remembered the moment when the slap had echoed in the cabin, and they realized how each of them had frozen in silence. Not one of them had stepped forward to defend their passenger, their leader, the owner of the jet. And in that silence, they had failed not just her, but themselves. The CEO observed them with calm eyes. She did not enjoy watching their discomfort, but she also did not regret her decision. She knew the lesson had to be sharp for it to last. Leadership was not about allowing disrespect to take root. It was about removing it at the moment it appeared, no matter how uncomfortable the consequences. After a few minutes, she called one of her assistants who often traveled with her. Quietly, she gave instructions to make arrangements for a new team of professionals to be ready for her future flights. She wanted people who understood that service was not about status or ego, but about responsibility. She wanted a team that valued discipline, fairness, and above all, respect. As the assistant began making calls, the CEO returned her gaze to the window. The clouds drifted by, endless and white, and she allowed herself a moment to breathe. This was not the first time she had faced conflict, nor would it be the last. But each time, she chose to act in a way that aligned with her values. That was why she had risen to the place she now stood. Meanwhile, the crew sat quietly in the back, whispering among themselves. Some blamed the flight attendant who had caused the incident. Others admitted their own guilt for not speaking up. A few even tried to comfort each other, reminding themselves that this was a lesson they would never forget. They all knew that when they walked off the jet later, they would not be the same. They had been part of a story that would travel far beyond this cabin. The CEO, though firm, did not hold hatred in her heart. She had made her decision, and for her, that was enough. She was not a person who carried grudges. She simply believed in accountability. If someone made a mistake, they must face the consequences. And if others allowed the mistake to continue without action, they too shared the responsibility. This was the principle she had applied in her company for years, and it had made her business stronger. She thought back to her younger years, to the times when she had been forced to swallow disrespect because she had no power to resist it. She had promised herself that when she finally had the authority, she would never let those moments pass unanswered. Today, she had kept that promise. 10 minutes had been enough for her to decide. She had given the crew a chance to reflect, a space for their own conscience to rise, but they had chosen silence. And so, her choice had been made. She did not shout, she did not humiliate, she simply acted with clarity. That was her strength. As the flight continued, she began reviewing her work notes again, preparing for the meetings ahead. To an outsider, it might have seemed as though nothing unusual had happened, as though she were simply another traveler making use of her time. But those who had been in the cabin knew better. They had witnessed a moment of leadership that would mark them forever. The crew whispered less as the hours went on. They sat quietly, lost in thought. Some wondered if they would ever find jobs again in such an industry. Others thought about how they had allowed their fear to silence them. Each one carried regret in their own way. But deep down, they also carried respect. They had seen a woman who refused to bend, who refused to allow disrespect to linger, and though her decision had ended their positions, it had also taught them something powerful about dignity and strength. When the jet finally began its descent, the CEO looked calm, prepared for the work awaiting her on the ground. The city below came into view, tall buildings rising like silver towers under the afternoon sun. The attendants busied themselves with final tasks, their movements slower than usual, weighed down by the knowledge that this was their last flight under her command. As the jet touched down smoothly on the runway, the CEO stood, collected her things, and prepared to leave. The crew lined up as they always did, but their faces were solemn. She walked past them with quiet grace, pausing only once to turn and say, in a calm voice, that dignity must always be protected. Her words were simple, but they carried more power than any long speech could. With that, she stepped out of the cabin and into the world beyond, ready to face her business responsibilities. Behind her, the crew stood in silence, their futures uncertain but their lesson clear. They knew that what had happened on this flight was not just about one mistake, but about values that mattered more than any job. The CEO walked with her usual confidence, her head held high, her steps steady. She did not look back. She did not need to. She had acted, and her actions would speak for themselves long after the story was told. For her, leadership was not about popularity. It was about courage, about doing the right thing even when it was difficult. And on this day, in the quiet cabin of her own jet, she had once again proven why she stood where she did, strong, respected, and unshakable. When the CEO stepped off her jet that day, she did so with the same calm strength she had carried her entire life. The air outside was warm, the city alive with movement, and she blended into the rhythm with her usual composure. To those who saw her, she was simply a powerful business leader arriving for important meetings. But to those who had been in the cabin, the memory of what had happened would never fade. News travels faster than people realize. Within hours, whispers of the incident began to move from one corner of the business world to another. Some told the story with surprise, others with disbelief, and many with admiration. A woman of such influence had not just defended her dignity but had made a bold decision that sent a message beyond the walls of her jet. She had shown that respect was not something that could be ignored, not even for a moment. Back in her office, she returned to her work as if nothing unusual had happened. She reviewed reports, signed documents, and prepared for the negotiations ahead. But in quiet moments, she reflected on the events of the flight. She did not see it as just a clash between her and a flight attendant. To her, it was something larger, a reminder that leadership meant facing hard choices and making decisions that others might avoid. Her team of executives noticed the same calm in her as always. She did not share the details widely, but she did not need to. Those closest to her already understood her values. They knew she was the kind of leader who would never allow disrespect to remain unchallenged. And that was one of the many reasons they followed her with loyalty. Meanwhile, the story reached further. Business journals began to mention it. People debated about whether firing the entire crew was too severe. Some argued that she should have punished only the one responsible, while others said her action was exactly what leadership demanded. But regardless of opinion, one truth stood clear: her response had left a mark. It reminded people that true leaders did not tolerate silence in the face of wrongdoing. For the CEO herself, it was not about the debates or the opinions. It was about living according to her principles. She had built her company on values of respect, fairness, and accountability, and she was determined to carry those values into every space, even onto her own jet. She believed consistency was the heart of integrity. If she demanded respect in the boardroom, she had to demand it everywhere. As days turned into weeks, the impact of that moment began to show in unexpected ways. Some of the former crew members, though hurt at first, later admitted that the lesson had changed them. A few found new jobs and carried with them a stronger sense of professionalism. They told others about the importance of speaking up, of standing for what was right even when it was uncomfortable. What they had lost in a job, they had gained in wisdom. For the CEO, the incident became part of her story, one more chapter in a life filled with trials and victories. She did not boast about it, but when people asked her about leadership, she often spoke about accountability. She explained that leadership was not just about guiding others when things were easy, it was about standing firm when things were difficult, about making decisions that showed courage even when they were unpopular. Her company continued to grow. New opportunities opened, new partnerships formed, and her influence spread even wider. She became not just a business leader but also a voice of inspiration for many who faced challenges of their own. People looked to her and saw someone who had risen from humble beginnings, who had carried herself with grace despite obstacles, and who had never compromised on her values. One evening, as she sat by the window of her home, she thought about how far she had come. She remembered the little girl who once dreamed under the dim light of a lamp, and she smiled. Life had tested her many times, but each test had made her stronger. And this latest incident, though shocking in the moment, was simply another reminder of who she was and what she stood for. She understood that not everyone would agree with her decision, and that was fine. Leadership was not about pleasing everyone, it was about being true to yourself and to the principles that guided you. She had chosen clarity over compromise, and she would choose it again if the moment ever returned. The story of the flight spread beyond the world of business. Ordinary people who read about it found inspiration in her firmness. Some said it encouraged them to stand up for themselves in their own lives. Others said it taught them the value of holding people accountable. Her actions became more than a business decision, they became a lesson about dignity and self-respect. Months later, when she boarded her jet again, she did so with a completely new crew. This team had been carefully chosen, not just for their skills but for their professionalism and respect. The atmosphere in the cabin was different now, warm, disciplined, and filled with the kind of energy she valued. She knew that she had set a standard, and this team was determined to live up to it. As the jet lifted into the sky once more, she leaned back into her seat and allowed herself a quiet breath of peace. She did not fear disrespect anymore because she had proven to herself, and to the world, that she would never allow it to take root. She had defended her dignity once, and she would always do so again. For her, the journey was never just about wealth or power. It was about the lessons she left behind, the examples she set for others, and the legacy she built through her actions. And though many stories would be told about her life, this one would always stand out as a reminder that true strength is not loud, it is calm, firm, and unshakable. She had been struck, but she had not been shaken. She had been tested, but she had not been broken. And in the end, she had shown the world what it truly meant to lead.